The ones we love are enemies of the state. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shelf Life. This is Simran, and this is a podcast where we talk about books, their philosophies, and most importantly, our personal relationship with the book. And today I want to talk about a personal favorite of mine again. This is a book that was published in 2017. It was long-listed in the Man Booker Prize list, and that's how I came to know about it, because the Man Booker Prize list is something that I have been following for a while. And I think if you read books and if you're someone who is a connoisseur of stories, if I have to say that, you should definitely be looking at the Man Booker Prize list every year, and you should be checking out whatever books are there and see if you like any of it. See if something strikes your attention, see if you really feel like picking something up. And that's a great way to learn more about books and learn about what's new in the business. Anyway, so the quote that I started with today is actually from the original Greek play called Antigone, written by Sophocles. Now, if any of you are familiar with Greek mythology, you would know that Greek plays were extremely dramatic. They had a lot of, elements of just absolute beauty, and they had a way that they could speak to you, and which is why even years after they were written and performed, we still go back to those plays and we still remember those plays, and we try to reimagine them and take something from them, and that's exactly what the author of this book, Kamila Shamsie, that's exactly what she did as well. She reimagined one of Sophocles' plays, Antigone, as a modern story, as a story set in modern day, London. And she reimagined it like that, and she has new characters, but the plot is essentially based on what happens in Antigone and what happens with the characters in Antigone. And the reason I picked this book was honestly because I think not a lot of people have heard of this book. I mean, I have not come across anyone who read it, and I absolutely love the book, and I think it's written so well. And I know that there are a lot of Greek mythology fans these days. I know that I am not one of them. I haven't been. I don't belong to the cult of people who read a lot of Percy Jackson growing up. And I remember that because, I had a lot of friends in school who would bring Percy Jackson books to school, and they would get reprimanded for that. And I always wondered, is that book really worth it? Is it even worth getting reprimanded? But anyway, that's what I was saying, that there's a lot of people who love Greek mythology, and they love, books that are based on certain characters from Greek history, and they want to read more of that. And I feel like, as someone who didn't read a lot of Greek mythology, this book was definitely something that got me really, really interested. And I had not read Antigone, and after this book, after I read Home Fire, I read Antigone, and I started to read more of Greek mythology and stories that I liked. And I also happened to pick up Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles. If any of you have read it, that's great. But if you really want to read more Greek mythology, and which is told in a very beautiful way with amazing prose, you can always pick that book up. It's Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. She's got some other books as well. Circe is one of her other books, and you can check that out as well. It's really, really good. Coming back to Home Fire, now I don't want to get into the entire argument of, whether the original was better or whether this one was better. I don't want to get into that because that's a debate that, people have all the time, and it's a debate that will never end. And I specifically don't like it. I don't appreciate it because I personally think that, we have enough space in our culture, in our world, to allow both of these streams to exist, to allow both of these pieces of literature to exist and to appreciate. It shouldn't be about one against the other. I don't think Kamila Shamsie wrote this book for people to not think about Antigone. In fact, I think she wrote this book so that people knew about Antigone and what the story was and how it goes. And this one, even though it stands out, because since I've read both, I can say that they are different stories, and there's a lot of elements in Homefire that are very unique to Homefire and that are not a part of Antigone. And I'll explain to you what exactly the plot of Antigone was, so that you get an idea of what Homefire is, right? But what I noticed was that even though they're different, she still managed to retain that essence. She still managed to maintain the heart of that book, that play, and that's a really tough thing to do, I think, as writers, especially as translators. I think, anyone who is writing like a remake, or is writing, a translation, I think it's definitely difficult to retain the essence of the original, and to still make it like an ode to the original, not a completely separate piece of work. And I think translators, honestly, I think they get a lot of crap for this. They get a lot of hate for what they do because, translations are not the best thing in the world and all of that. But I think, there is a lot of merit in the job. There is a lot of hard work that goes into it. And some translators, yes, are quite bad in what they do, are quite questionable, but some are really, really good. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, translation in our next episode. So I don't want to get too much into it. But yeah, there's that. And let's get into Antigone. All right. Let me tell you about Antigone. So Antigone was a play, like I said, written by Sophocles. And Antigone is a character in the play. She is a woman. She is the daughter of Oedipus. I don't want to say it, but Oedipus from the infamous Oedipus complex. And she's the daughter of Oedipus and his wife, which, again, I don't want to say it, but I guess was his mother. I'm not sure. And she is their daughter, and she has a brother and a sister. Her sister's name is Ismene. Her brother's name is Polynices. Yeah, and there's a lot of other characters whose names I cannot pronounce for the life of me, and I'm not going to try. But the story is essentially that of Antigone's struggle, and the struggle that she faces while trying to seek a sort of justice and honor for someone that she loves. Not for herself, but someone she loves, which is her brother. And when her brother is killed by her uncle in a war, because that's what they did in the old days. You went to war. And because his brother was killed, and the tradition was that when the enemy clan kills you, you don't get to be buried. You don't get to have your last rites. And Antigone really wanted that for her brother, and she does a lot. She goes beyond what is considered acceptable and honorable to save her brother's honor, and to save that little bit of respect that should be bestowed on him, according to her. So Antigone is essentially a tragedy. And tragedies, Greek tragedies, and that word, um, a Greek tragedy is something that you hear a lot these days, right? I mean, you throw it around all the time. Everyone throws it around. People who read books, people who don't read books, everyone knows what a Greek tragedy is. But I don't think you might know what exactly it means. Like when you go really deep into the meaning, like the literary version of it. So I want to tell you a little bit about that, if you don't mind. I would like to tell you about what a Greek tragedy really is. Like, I'll just sum it up in a few words. Um, so, a Greek tragedy, as defined by Aristotle, is one where in the play there is a very noble character, a character that comes from a very high position, who essentially, has a sort of a tragic flaw, or has something go wrong, in his fate, that in the way that fate plays with him. Um, and then that character essentially goes through a series of his own downfall. There's a process of entropy that occurs, and that process of entropy most of the times results in his or her own death, and that death can, at a lot of times, you know pull out a lot of sympathy from those who are watching the play or reading the play. So that's essentially what a Greek tragedy is. Those are the elements of a Greek tragedy, and that's a definition given by Aristotle, who, honestly, Aristotle, I mean, I don't want to go into a Aristotle rant here, but Aristotle was, very wrong about a lot of things. And I don't know, did anyone actually respect Aristotle? Did anyone really take him seriously? I don't know. I'm going on a different track, but anyway, it's a definition given by Aristotle, and you see it a lot in a lot of your tragedies, even in Shakespearean tragedies. In fact, like take for example Hamlet. And if you want a reimagining of Hamlet, you can take Heather, which had Shahid Kapoor in it, and that's a great example of a reimagining of a classic story. And even in that, Hamlet is a character who comes from a very high position. He comes from a noble background, but he has a tragic flaw. Fate plays with him, a wicked game. And because of that, he goes through a process of entropy where he loses a lot, and there's a lot of sadness and all of that stuff, right? And essentially, it ends with us feeling very, very bad for Hamlet. So tragedies are essentially supposed to pull that sympathy out of you, pull that emotion of, I don't know why I'm feeling this way for this character, but I am feeling it, that emotion. Tragedies are meant to create that. And that's exactly what Home Fire does. Home Fire very explicitly tells you that you are going to be feeling for characters that you didn't think you would feel for. And it really tests you. I'll tell you the story, I'll tell you the background of what Home Fire is really all about, okay? So this is how the book starts. The first scene has the character Isma, who is Antigone's sister. Antigone is Anika in this book. She's her sister. And she is at the London airport. She's a British citizen, and she's at the London airport. And the first scene, how the book opens, is that she is late for her flight because she is being pulled aside from the security line, and she is, asked to go through an extra search. I guess that's what they call it, and that is of course because she's Muslim. And in that, it's so poignant. I never know how to say that word, but it's so beautiful the way that that line is written, where she's being interrogated by the officers, and they ask her a question, and they go, "Do you consider yourself a British citizen?" And she says, "Yes, it's on my passport. I am a British citizen." And they say, "But do you consider yourself one?" And that's, that gives you an idea of what this book might be about, about, and it sets the tone, I feel, for the entire book. And it makes you feel like, and but the more you get to know Isma, and you get to know Antigone, Anika, which is, and their entire family. Polonices is Parvez in this book. When you get to know their entire dynamic, and you get to know the background that they come from, the fact that their father was, and I'm not ruining anything for you when I say this, but their father was, father had left them, abandoned them to join the jihadi movement. That's right. And their mother dies, and Isma is the only one taking care of her siblings, and they essentially grow up in a very tough environment, and they grow up in very tough conditions, and they are molded with a lot of pain and transformation that they probably wouldn't have asked for, right? And that, of course, in the world that we live in, we can understand that. If you are a minority, if you are any kind of minority, you know that that is a reality you go through. And that is brought out, I mean, you understand that Kamila Shamsie is trying to make a point, even though this is, a reimagining of a classic story. She is trying to tell you that this is very much real. And this happens in real life. This happens in our world. People are pulled over by the security team and at airports, and they are asked absurd questions, and you get to know that they do grow up in extremely tough conditions, and most of the times you can't do anything about it, right? And she's trying to set the tone for that. She's trying to set the tone for, these are characters that you probably know, but you are going to feel a lot more for them than you would have imagined. And she's not trying to tell you that these are perfect characters, because they're not. They have their flaws. They do their mistakes. They mess up, but you still feel for them and not for anyone else. And that's really interesting, because the whole book is essentially from these siblings' perspectives, right? It's their story. So the first chapter is by Isma, who's the oldest, and who, she's kind of like a mother figure to the twins, Antigone and Polonices, Anika and Parvez. And she's like a mother figure to them. She takes care of them. She, puts them first and all of that. And the twins they have their own life. And in present day, their brother, Parvez, he has disappeared, and there's of course talks that he has also joined the jihadi movement like his father. So this family, these two sisters, that they're going through a lot, and they have been through a lot. But, what was really beautiful about this book was that Kamila Shamsie shows you that even if you're family, you can be extremely different people, and you probably might not even realize it. Like the way that they deal with their problems, the way that they deal with their identity, the way that they deal with their parents' death, with their brother's disappearance and his, consequent joining into the ISIS, the way they deal with all of that, it's very different. Isma, the older one, is supposed to be the passive one, the one who's a little more quiet, a little more reserved, a little more anxious. Anika is the headstrong one. She's the stubborn one. She's the one who fights it out. And she's also the tragic character. She's the one who suffers a lot in the end. And who pays a lot for her suffering. So you see that these are two very different characters, but they're shown as part of the same thread. And it's very tough to do as a writer, I think it could be very tough to write something like that, where you have to show that these are two very different people who have very different backgrounds and very different ways of behaving, but they're still connected through something. There is something in them that is still the same, and it could be anything. And you look at that, and you look at probably your own life you can maybe pick out some similarities there. Maybe you have a sibling that who is very much unlike you, but you are still tied to them. You are still tied, and it's more than just the sibling relationship. It's more than just being part of the same family. There's something greater than blood, right? There has to be. There's something greater than familiarity and comfort. And that's what Kamila Shamsie really brings out in this book. She brings out the fact that you can be different but still love each other. You can have different ways of doing things but still be together. And it's a struggle. It's not going to be, it's not absolute. You're not going to reach a point where it's all okay, but it's a struggle that you keep taking for the ones that you love, right? And that really, I want to wrap this element up with this one quote that I've always kept in my mind. It's actually a Vietnamese proverb that says, brothers and sisters are as close as hands and feet. It's very simple, but I don't know, it just always, stuck with me. So there's that. And since we're talking about tragedies and we're talking about, of course, we talked about how Polynices, which is Pervez in this book, he goes to join the ISIS, right? And the plot, the driving force in the book is that his sisters are trying to find, not him, but they're trying to find some version of him that can be accepted in their world, in the world that he left behind. They're trying to find some sort of solace in that version of him. And that really gets you, and even Antigone is about that. Antigone, the entire story of Antigone is about how Antigone is trying, beyond what can be conceived as possible. She goes beyond that to get a proper burial, just a burial for her brother, who is supposed to be of the enemy state, right? Who's supposed to be the enemy and who doesn't deserve a proper burial. But she says, no, there is something greater than blood. There is something greater than just familial ties that drives her. And in the end, it does drive her to her own entropy. It does drive her to her own death, but she still goes there. She still does it. And in Home Fire, in a very modern world, you see that even though it's been thousands and thousands of years since Sophocles wrote this play, the situation is still the same. When in our world someone is just ostracized, it's very difficult to get them back, right? And we know that. We have so many things that attest to that. We have, in modern lingo, we have cancel culture. In even older generations, I think they have this sense of, if someone's wrong, if someone's been perceived as wrong once, it's very difficult to get them back. And that brings the question again of who deserves to be remembered and for what? Do we remember people by the deeds that they did, by the choices that they made, or do we remember them just for what they meant to us and who they were? And that's something I want you to think about. That one question: who deserves to be remembered and for what? Do you think it was right that the sisters wanted to, honor their brother who had, gone on to join the ISIS and all of that, but he was still their brother, and they wanted to remember him. They wanted to love him. They wanted to keep him, some part of him. Were they wrong in that? Was it wrong of them? What would you do? Considering, I'm not saying someone from your family would join the ISIS, but I'm not saying that it's even remotely close to that situation, but what would you do? How would you remember the people who are in your life today if they hurt you, if they betrayed you, if they betrayed that version of you that you think is true? something you can think about. And I think that ties really well with like a very overarching theme of tragedy that we've taken today, right? We're talking about tragedies. We talked about Antigone, we talked about Hamlet, and we can talk about a lot of other books as well. But the core idea that I want to leave you with, that I want you to think about this week, is, you know, is something that I have personally thought about a lot. And as a student of English literature and someone who, has to study all of this for academic purposes, this is something that I genuinely struggle with a lot, which is the definition of tragedy, right? How do you define tragedy? It in very literary terms, in a very technical way, tragedy has the element of fate in it. So essentially what I'm saying is that it is believed, or it can be believed, that some people are destined to have tragedy, to be tragic characters, to have some sort of tragic flaw that leads them down that path. And it can be said that you are bound to your destiny. You are the result of your destiny. And tragedy is essentially, just an exercise of that fact. But there's also another aspect, there's also another school of thought that says that tragedy is through your choices. Tragedy is through free will. When people make choices that they shouldn't probably be making, it leads to consequences that they don't want to own up to. Right? And you see that in Antigone, you see that in Home Fire as well. If Polonices hadn't made the decision that he did, if Parvez hadn't gone on and joined the ISIS, he would still be with his sisters. His sisters would still have the semblance of a comfortable life, right? Their lives wouldn't have cascaded down that path of tragedy in that way. But then again, would it really have been completely comfortable? I mean, that's what Kamila Shamsie wants us to think about. Like, with that opening that I mentioned to you about Isma being, picked out of the security search at the airport, her identity, something that she absolutely cannot control, something that she was born with, is used against her in her everyday life already. It's not the fact that she's the sister of, a man who went off to the ISIS. It's not that. It's just her identity that pulls her apart. So, in a way, was it because of the choices that her brother made that she had a tragic life? Or was it because she was probably destined to have that life? She was born into it. She was born into her own destiny. So that's something that I want you to think about. And again, Aristotle, who had an opinion about everything and shouldn't have, had an opinion about this as well. But, I don't want to mention it. I want you to think about this on your own. Why do we define tragedy the way that we do? And how do you define it? Is it fate or is it free will? Do you think free will exists? Do you think fate exists? How do you define the two? So think about that. And I would love to know what you would have to say about that. I would love to hear your comments, and if you have your own opinions to share with us, you can always do so. Just before I close this episode, before we wrap it up, I want to share a little bit of an anecdote with you all. I want to share something that, I was researching this book again. I read it quite a while back, and I was thinking of how I would, why and how it meant as much as it did to me. And I thought about this, and I remember I could not possibly know what it means to be Muslim in this world. I would never understand the pain or the joy or any of it, right? I can understand being a minority because I am a woman, but I can't possibly understand what it means to be Muslim. And I have this, I spoke to a very close person in my life, and I asked him, we've spoken about this quite a lot before as well. He's someone I've known since I was a kid, and we've been friends for a very long time, and we've talked about this a lot, about how differences creep up in our identity and we don't even know about it, right? We are not made aware of our identity until we come of age, or we go through something, right? Personal experience or otherwise. And even though you've lived your whole lives together, even though you seemingly had the same kind of lives, you can still have very different experiences. And he is Muslim, and I wanted to just understand more of what that world would be like, because I obviously wouldn't know. And I remember this one incident that happened. I remember this one conversation that we have had in the past, and it just struck me. And I wanted to talk about it today because I think it's just such a scary thing. And at that point I didn't register it, but now I do. And it's just this one incident where many years ago we were just talking, just laughing around, and I remember it was this one conversation where someone in our school, I think someone in our batch, had very jokingly called him a terrorist. And I remember he didn't respond to it. My friend didn't respond to it. And I remember just joking around and asking him why he didn't respond to that. And he said, well, there's nothing I can do about that. And, at that point, it didn't strike me as much. I didn't think about it a lot. But now I do. Now I actually think about it. It's almost as if that fact was adopted into his identity. And he was made to feel like it was a part of him, even when it wasn't. And, so many years later now, just a few days ago, I asked him, because I was doing this book, and I just really wanted to know what he had to say, even though he's never read any books. I just asked him, what do you feel about your identity? How do you see yourself? How do you feel about your identity? And the one thing he said that really struck out to me was that it's a feeling of not being included. It's not the feeling of facing a lot of discrimination that bothers you. It's not the fact there's a lot of troubles you have to go through, a lot of a lot of trials that you face. It's the feeling of not being there, of not existing, of just surviving, of just getting by. And I think that feeling, probably a lot of us will not understand unless we've been in that position where we've been made to feel that way, or we've grown into it. And I guess that, ties up with how Isma felt as well, right? It was just not being there, not being good enough to be there. And I asked him if he had that fear of existing with his identity, and he said that he did. But I asked him, when did you develop that fear? Has it always been there? Have you lived with it? Because, this is a person I've known literally my whole life, and I'm extremely close to him, and he doesn't seem like someone who can be scared of or bothered by anything. Trust me, anything. And he is not someone who overthinks his personality or identity a lot, but I asked him this, and he said that he realized it when he was 16 years old, which is around the time where someone had called him that. So I don't know if that's a coincidence, if someone called him a terrorist, but I don't know. It is around the time that happened. And he said that he kind of just woke up, he read the news, he saw what was happening around him. He woke up to the fact of his identity, of the implications of who he was. And I think that was something that really made me feel a lot. It made me feel sad, but it also made me feel like there was so much that we had to change in this world. There's so much that we have to do. There's so much wrong, but there's still so much hope, right? And that's what, that's what I want to leave y'all with. I don't want to leave y'all with the question that we always leave you with, which is, why do you think this story was told? I want to leave you with a different question. I want to leave you with a question that my friend asked me, right? This friend that I've been talking about, it's a question that he asked me. And he essentially posed it to all of the audience that's listening to this podcast. And he said something that, I thought was extremely touching, and I think you should think about that. He said that if all the Muslims, and I'm going to paraphrase here and say, if all the minorities in this world had to go away, if you had to make them go away, if you want them to go back, where exactly do you think they will go? And if they do, what exactly will happen to your world without them? What exactly will be left? The ones we love are enemies of the state. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to see you next time, and please feel free to answer all the questions in the comments below. Thank you very much.